Reformers had a ball after World War I as they gleefully ushered in Prohibition. Whether it was the will of the people that voted in Article 27 of the Constitution was not necessarily clear. Anyway, there were a few who minded the restrictions and some others who had a field day smashing bottles. The police searched out every place where hooch was being made, and they carted it away.
Hi, I'm John Sleeman. I'm the chairman and founder of Sleeman Breweries. Interesting bit of history about the Sleemans. They were brewers in England back in the 1700s and the 1800s. And they decided to try their fortunes in the New World. So they came to Canada in 1834, settled in an area near St. Catharines, and brewed beer there for about 20 years. But interestingly, with the advent of the American Industrial Revolution, the groundwater, which is incredibly important to beer, started to get polluted. And eventually the groundwater got polluted to the point where they couldn't make beer anymore. And so my great-great-grandfather, John H. Sleeman, started looking around Ontario for places that had wells with good water. And he tried, believe it or not, Hamilton, and he tried Barrie and London and Guelph, and he took samples. And because the chemists in those days were still in the United Kingdom, he had to send all the samples back to the United Kingdom to find out where the best water was. And he wanted water that would be like English water, particularly water like Burton-on-Trent, which is the middle of England where the great ales of England are produced to this day. And anyway, the samples came back from London, England, and they said, well, if you want to make English ales, the place with the best water is Guelph. So in the early 1850s, he moved his family to Guelph, and they produced beer for another 50 or 60 years. Prohibition came along. They had a second brewery called the Springbank Brewery in Guelph, so they had two breweries. And they were doing quite well, and I guess the lure of easy money during Prohibition meant that they continued to make beer, but they were smuggling it to the United States and Canadians. And they continued all through Prohibition and got away with it. Our first products were geared towards English-type products for English people who had emigrated or Scottish or Irish. We'll call them British. But interestingly, as those first immigrants started to have children, just down the road in what used to be called Berlin, but is now Kitchener-Waterloo, a lot of people from the continent settled there. So you had a pretty high German population, and they wanted products that were more like theirs, which were lager-type products. So eventually my great-grandfather started making lagers for them. And then the kids of those original immigrants wanted something that their parents were not drinking. And so that's how we got cream ale. What my great-grandfather did was he took one of his English ales and he took one of the lagers he was making for the folks over in Berlin, and he literally poured them together. And he came up with a product in the middle which he called cream ale. Now eventually he wrote a recipe for the cream ale, and in our recipe book we've got 4 or 5 variations of that. Now a lot of small craft brewers are developing cream ales, but we still notice tremendous loyalty for our cream ale. It's still one of those products that defines us. Canadian Prohibition ended in the late 1920s, and American Prohibition continued for about another 5 years or so, to about 1933. And it was during that time, when it was legal to make beer in Canada, that they continued to smuggle to Al Capone and his guys in the States. That's when they got caught. So in 1933, the Sleeman family got caught for smuggling and not paying its Canadian taxes on the beer they were smuggling. And they were told no one with the last name Sleeman will be given a federal excise license, which is what you need to make beer. You need a government license. And so my aunt, whose dad was one of the last people to run the brewery or work in the beer business for Sleeman's, he had an old recipe book, and it talks about him learning at the feet of his father how do you become a brewer, and it covers about a year and a half in the late 1800s. And when my Aunt Florian realized that we were going to be out of business, she said to her dad, "Can I have that recipe book, and can I have an old bottle of beer? I'd like to hang on to it for that 50 years and see if anybody in the Sleeman family 50 years from now is interested in the business. And she came along 50 years later in 1983, 1984, and said, you should find out about this history. Here's the old recipe book and an old bottle of beer. And so we spent several weekends, me just listening basically, and trying to retain it up here about the family history. How did we get in the beer business? Why aren't we in the beer business anymore? Who was the brewmaster? What's our English heritage? She had an unbelievable amount of information, and she decided that she was going to be, as when her dad passed away, my grandfather, she was going to be the repository of all the information for the family. And she was literally waiting for some offspring at some generation to show some interest. And so I'm not the only grandkid in the Sleeman family. There are lots of grandkids. But I was the only one who ended up in the beer business, and so she said, okay, I guess it's going to be you. One of the things that was important to me when my Aunt Florian gave me the recipe book was to be authentic and go back and take some of those recipes and see if we could make beer with them. And so we went through the recipe book and found on page 64 a recipe for cream ale. We test brewed it, everybody liked it. And so we made our cream ale in 1988 to that recipe, and we still follow that recipe today. Our Silver Creek Lager is out of the recipe book. Our Sleeman Original Dark is out of the recipe book. Several others. Our India Pale Ale is out of the recipe book. Our Porter is out of the recipe book. One of our most popular products is Sleeman Honey Brown, which is basically one of my great-grandfather's recipes for lager. And we buy big pails of Billy Bee honey, original local honey from people here, not chemically treated, the real deal, all natural, and we actually pour it in when we make the beer. So, I mean, that's a variation on the recipe, but the recipe book has lots of products that we've never made yet, so there's still lots of potential products to come in the future.